What's up, everyone? We just finished up fishing here at Lake Murray in South Carolina. Finished up with a decent event. We're somewhere in the 30s. I don't know exactly. 34th, 5th, 6th, something like that. 30 something in that range. And, you know, had a lot of fun. Had some frustrating moments. This is a lake full of blueback herring, and it seems like any lake that has that, those fish just, they migrate towards that. It's like a big magnet for those fish, and so they change their habits, the way they live, the way they feed, the way they set up on structure based on that bait fish. So keep that in mind if you're going to a blueback herring lake. So for me, time of year wise, there's still a lot of fish spawning. There's a lot of post-spawn fish, and there's a few pre-spawn fish. But a lot of the biggest fish were not quite all the way to those points where the herring would spawn. And it seemed like they were kind of in between the spawn and that post-spawn points and stuff. So a lot of them were relating to docks and things like that. And then you had schools of herring fish that had some big fish mixed in with them. A lot of 2 and 3 pounders, and then your bigger ones were kind of those 3.5, 4, and 4.5 pounders, and then every once in a while, you know, there's a 5 or 6 or 7 pounder mixed in there. But most of them are kind of in that schooler range, and so I kind of kept it simple, but did a lot of different things with just a few key baits this week. And I was targeting all those different pieces of structure, right? Docks, points, and really the biggest key was using the Humminbird VX charts. Those have depth shading on them, and it seemed like anywhere where it would go from the real deep red shallow flat points, you had those long extending flat places, and then it started to transition into kind of that orange and yellow on the depth shading. That's right where a lot of these fish were sitting, and then they would move up and feed on those dark red flat shallow places, and then they would slide back down. And so if you could find the combination of those two colors, there were going to be schooling fish around those areas. And to target those, my main deal was a topwater. So I was throwing the Stormarashi topwalker, and just really, I would pull up, I would fish that bait around. But the biggest thing is I was waiting for those fish to actually come up in school, and that was your best odds of getting a bite. It was really hard to just fish around with anything and actually get a bite, but if they came up actively schooling, you could catch those fish. Throwing it on 40-pound Conzen braid, actually broke my other rod on the way back. Actually, it's right here. This right here, that happened from my 360. Took my 360 off, had too many rods on my deck, and it was a bumpy ride, and it smashed my rod. This one that I was actually throwing had a 30-pound Seaguar Tactex braid on it, which was awesome. This is the reel that it was on. But I just swapped it over for Santee. So this one has Conzen, that's what I used to throw. This week I actually was throwing the 30-pound Tactex braid, which I loved. First tournament that I've messed around with it, and absolutely loved it for throwing topwaters. I could long bomb it way out there without backlashing and getting stuck in it, and then throwing it on the good old trusty Daiwa Steez A 7.1 to 1 and the Alpha Angler top hammer, 7-foot medium. It's my favorite topwater rod ever, of all time, ever. And then when I needed a bigger fish, I went to the docks, and it seemed like the docks that played were the ones that were closest to those herring points. It's like the big largemouth hadn't got there, and if you had a deep transition where those contour lines got real tight and close together, and then there was a dock there, you know, adjacent to that point, there would be sometimes one big one or a school of big fish that lived underneath that dock. And I don't know if it was just because that was a piece of cover they felt comfortable on before they got to the point. There was still bait fish around. And for that, I ended up throwing a new glide bait for me. I haven't messed with this one a lot, but it's built for herring lakes, and it's called a clutch darter. and it's different than a lot of glide baits. It's got a wider hinge and this kind of longer front section, and it's very narrow, very thin bait. And what that does is it imitates those herring really well. And for me, it worked well around the docks. It's got a real slow sink rate, but I could twitch it kind of back and forth, right? It doesn't have a big glide, right? It's not even really a glide bait. It's more of like a twitch bait that twitches back and forth because of the way that it's built and the balance of it. But worked really, really well. It seemed like the fish reacted to it better than the other glide baits that I had tried, you know, more shad shaped ones and things like that. And the size profile seemed to match up perfect. So ended up catching the biggest fish of the week for me on that bait. Weighed a fish on it every day, I think, except for the third day, and multiple fish on it each day, I believe. So that was super cool. And then I'd mixed in some sight fishing. So if I was going between docks and you would see a good one on a bed, and if I thought that it was, you know, fairly easy to catch, I didn't have to spend too much time on it, I went with my number one. Let me fix this here. My number one bait for bed fishing is the X-Zone Adrenaline Craw. We've got that mixed up with a 3/8 ounce X-Zone Tungsten, a 4/0 VMC Redline EWG hook, and throwing that on the Alpha Angler Hitter 7.6 heavy, and my favorite flip and pitch and reel, the Daiwa Tatula Elite PF in 8.1 to 1. I just love those bigger knobs and handles for getting the power out of those faster reels. Throwing it on 22-pound Seagar Tatsu. So I actually had the same exact line on both rods. I was throwing the clutch darter on 22-pound Tatsu, Tatula 300 and 6.3 to 1. Lots of power in that with 110 millimeter handle, and the Alpha Angler Wide Glide, which is probably a little bit more than what you need for that bait. You could get away with a lighter setup on that bait, but being around the docks and there are big fish here, I wanted to be able to have enough, and the Wide Glide's got enough tip that I could throw that bait. So really good event, you know, coming off of Lake Seminole and the Classic and not doing too well at those two. It felt good to kind of be back in it, get some cut ice cream, figure some things out, feel a little bit dialed in, and I'm looking forward to getting over to Santee Cooper.